Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Richard Freeman. Now, Richard is a cryptozoologist and an author. He co-edits both the journal Animals and Men and several editions of the annual Centre for Fortean Zoology Yearbook. He's written, co-written or edited quite a number of books and has contributed widely to both Fortean and zoological magazines, as well as other newspapers and periodicals. And that includes the Fortean Times and Paranormal magazine. He's also lectured across the UK at events such as the Fortean Times Unconvention, the Weird Weekend, Microcon, and also at museums and universities such as the Natural History Museum, the Grant Museum of Zoology, and Queen Mary University of London, and the Last Tuesday Society. Yeah? Now, Richard claims an obsession with the science fiction series Doctor Who, which sparked his interest in all things that are weird. I remember watching the first ever episode of Doctor Who, and hiding behind the sofa. I think it was about 9 or 10 or something. Now then, he studied zoology at Leeds University and went on to become a zookeeper at Twycross Zoo. Then he worked in an exotic pet shop, a reptile rescue centre. He was also even a grave digger at one time. Now, he eventually moved to Devon, where he became a zoological director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology. Now, he's travelled the world searching for a variety of cryptids, from the yeti, orange pendek, and the Tasmanian wolf to other legendary creatures such as the Mongolian death worm and the giant anaconda. Now, I thought he ran a goth shop. I don't know where I got that from, but he is goth, I think. So anyway, tonight he's not got any white makeup or black clothes and Dr. Martens on. But he has joined us to give us a talk entitled An Introduction to Cryptozoology. So please put your hands together, please, for Mr. Richard Freeman. Thank you.
I did have the Robert Smith hair once, but it all fell out and I turned bald at 21 and got fat at the same year. So I have to go for the grimly fiendish look now. Cryptozoology. The name comes from the Latin cryptos, meaning hidden, and zoology, meaning animals. It is literally the study of hidden animals. Now, if you're talking about monsters and you're painting with very broad strokes, they fall into two categories. The first category, which is the category I'm going to be talking about tonight, are animals that are unknown to science. These are flesh and blood creatures, but we don't know much about them. And I'll be telling you, going into a little bit more detail later on. The second category are creatures that seem to be paranormal manifestations. I work mainly with the flesh and blood animals because I'm from a zoological background, but this other category that is slightly stranger is very interesting as well, and I've just written a book about it called The Highest Strangeness, which is out soon. So I'm also interested in that, but tonight's talk will be strictly on flesh and blood creatures. So can I have the next slide, please? The term cryptozoology was founded by this gentleman. He's a Belgian zoologist called Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans. He's the slightly less hairy one. And he wrote several books, some of which were translated into English, but not all. The book he's known best for is called On the Track of Unknown Animals. And in it, he postulates that a lot of creatures known through native folklore and some creatures from legend are actual flesh and blood animals, but ones we just know nothing about. And then a few years later, he wrote a second book called In the Wake of the Sea Serpents, where he looked at marine cryptids. Not all of his conclusions I agree with, but he is one of the founding fathers of cryptozoology. Could I have the next one, please? This guy is Ivan T. Sanderson. He was a Scottish zoologist, very interesting fellow. His father got gored to death by a rhinoceros in Africa. And he went all over the world, sort of like David Attenborough before David Attenborough and before telly. He went all over the world and he used to catch animals for zoos and study animals, and he had several encounters with strange creatures he couldn't identify, and together with Heuvelmans he coined the term cryptozoology, and he's one of the founding fathers of it. Now, before these guys, there were other people studying what is termed cryptozoology now, such as the German guy Willy Ley and a Dutch gentleman called Odemans. But these are the people that, the two people that founded really what we know cryptozoology is today, and they came up with the moniker. Next one, please. Cryptozoology in some countries has been treated very seriously indeed. This collection of people are the Snowman Commission. In Soviet Russia in the 1950s, they took the idea of creatures like the yeti and related creatures very seriously indeed. In Russia, they have a creature called the almasty, which is different to either the Himalayan yeti or the North American Sasquatch. They set up this commission, which was at governmental level, and the guy in the middle with the beard there is Peter Smolin, and he was the director of the Darwin Museum in Moscow, where the meetings were held. The balding guy with glasses is Boris Proshniev. He is not well known in the West, but in Russia he was a very celebrated scientific polymath, and he wrote several books on the possibility of relic hominins, that is, relatives of the ancestors of man, surviving into the present day. And one of the books he wrote, Problem of Relic Hominins, it only ever got a print run of 300. It was only ever printed in Russia. We tracked down his great-great-grandson, who was living in, I think, Michigan, if I remember, got the permission to reprint it, had it entirely translated into English and published under the title The Soviet Sasquatch. So all of that information that was unknown in the West is now available in English, all the information from the various expeditions of the Snowman Commission. And they went into the Pamir Mountains and the Caucasus Mountains. Unfortunately, the guy that was put in charge of it was a botanist, and he was more interested in looking for flowers than he was for relic hominins. So it was eventually disbanded when they didn't get results straight away, which was rather short-sighted of them. But they continued to meet in the Darwin Museum in Moscow. The lady there with the glasses, she died a couple of years ago, 15 days short of her 102nd birthday, and her name is Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann. She's half French, half Russian. Remarkable woman. She was a mountaineer. She was a colonel in World War II, very courageous, after which she was sent to a gulag in Siberia for a few years, managed to get out of that, and then got interested in the problem of strange man-like creatures, and spent the rest of her career in the Caucasus Mountains studying the almasty, which we'll be talking about a little later on. Can we have the next one, please? So, cryptozoology. It might seem like a strange idea in the world that is now completely mapped, and we have satellite imagery and things like that. You might think that the world is a well-known, well-mapped, almost tame place, and it's not. That's one of the biggest fallacies. Even in the age of satellite photography, there are great swathes of the world that are covered in rainforest and temperate forest. You can't see through the canopy. The depths of the sea are still unknown. I remember in my student days looking at maps of even relatively small places like Tasmania that had great areas on them where it said insufficient data. So the world has not been fully explored, and large, sometimes frightening animals still turn up, completely new to science. This is a giant squid, Architeuthis dux. This isn't a particularly big one. The largest specimen that was actually measured was cast ashore in, I believe, 1887 in the wonderfully named Thimble Tickle Bay in Newfoundland, and it was 60 feet long. There have been sightings of specimens of 100 foot plus. Nobody knows how big they grow, nobody knows much about their life cycle, how they feed. It was only recently that they were first caught on camera alive, and they're in a living creature. This is a dead one. As a living creature, they are remarkably beautiful. And once again, it was only a small specimen that was filmed, but it's believed that this creature is behind the stories of the kraken, a multi-armed monster from Norse folklore. And there was a French biologist, and this gentleman, he back in the turn of the 19th century, he postulated that the legends of the kraken were based on a gigantic squid. Now, at the time, the giant squid was unknown. This gentleman's name was Pierre Denis de Montfort, and he was an expert in molluscs, and he was one of the most celebrated biologists of his age. He worked for the Natural History Museum in Paris, and he was sent as far afield as Egypt, collecting specimens, and he wrote many books on molluscs and seashells and so forth. He got talking to whalers from Nantucket who had settled in Paris, and they told him about how how sperm whales in their death throes would vomit up these huge tentacles 30 feet or more long, and how they would have great sucker marks on their hides. And he postulated the existence of the giant squid, and when he came forth with his hypothesis, he became a scientific pariah. He lost his job at the Natural History Museum. He was spurned everywhere he went. He was forced to make a living selling seashells, and eventually died in 1820 in a Parisian gutter of starvation. In 1857, the first giant squid was actually found, and Pierre Denis de Montfort was proved correct. Can we have the next one, please? The mountain gorilla. It was a hairy monster from native folklore that lived in the mountains until 1905. The lowland gorilla was unknown until the 1860s. Explorers came back from the jungles and mountains of Africa with stories of these great man-like shaggy creatures covered in hair. And of course they were laughed at until the first specimens were captured. Even after the lowland gorilla of Central Africa was proved to exist, the mountain gorilla was still a myth for nearly half a century onwards. Now hold that in mind, a big, hairy, man-like creature from the mountains. Where have we heard that before? Can we have the next one, please? The okapi. It's a short-necked relative of the giraffe. The natives of the Congo spoke of a creature they said was a hybrid between a giraffe and a zebra, and you can see why they thought that. It was universally dismissed as nonsense by Western scientists until 1915, when the okapi was discovered. Its closest relative in the fossil record existed 15 million years ago. Can I have the next one, please? The Komodo dragon, the largest known lizard in the world, reaching a length of over 10 feet long. Completely unknown to science until shortly before World War I, when an aviator crashed on the island and had to hide up a tree or get eaten by these things. And there were rumours about these monstrous creatures living in the islands of Komodo for years, but no one had proved it. They can kill animals as large as water buffalo with a venomous bite. Now you can see that strand of saliva hanging off its chin. It's a little bit like me when I think about goth girls. They're the biggest venomous animal in the world. They have massive venom glands in their neck there, and they can inflict a terrible bite. And there are persistent rumours and sightings today in places like New Guinea of lizards that are 3 times the size of the Komodo dragon. And the next one, please. This is the coelacanth. It was a fish known from the fossil record, thought to have died out 65 million years ago, same time as the non-avian dinosaurs. In the 1930s, a lady who run a natural history museum in South Africa called Marjorie Courtney Latimer was at a fish market and she found one of them. It had been caught by the local fishermen. And subsequently it was found that they exist off the coast of South Africa and Madagascar at great depths, and more recently a second species has been found in Indonesia. Next one, please. The Chicoan peccary, a wild relative of the pigs from South America. It doesn't live in the jungle. It lives in the Gran Chaco area, which is scrubland and desert. Thought to have been extinct since the Ice Age. In the 1970s, they were found scurrying about, alive and well. Next one, please. The pygmy tapir. Only a few years ago, this was discovered in the jungles of South America, completely unknown. Tapirs are relatives of rhinos and horses. Next one, please. So, the precedent of large unknown animals is there. They're still being discovered, and I could go on and on. But let's have a look at the categories within cryptozoology. The first one is genuine unknown animals, and this is one of them. This is a reconstruction of what the nomads in the Gobi Desert called the Alroy hoi hoi, which translates as intestine worm, because they say it looks like a great length of cow's intestine. We in the West call it the death worm. And it first came into prominence in the West when the paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews, who they based Indiana Jones on, he was on an expedition to the Gobi Desert. He was looking for fossils of prehistoric man, and what he found actually were wonderful dinosaur eggs that were wonderfully well preserved. But the Prime Minister of Mongolia at the time told him to look out for the Alroy hoi hoi, the death worm, and because the nomads go in great fear of it. They say it can spit a corrosive yellow saliva that acts like acid, and it can give an electrical blast that can kill a full-grown camel, a bit like a electric eel. He didn't find one, but there were subsequent expeditions by people like the late Ivan Merkeley and myself, which we'll be talking about later on. But that's something that's completely unknown to science. Next one, please. Another category in cryptozoology is animals that are thought to be extinct but are probably still around. This is one of the most magnificent animals that has ever lived on Earth. It's called the thylacine, also known as the Tasmanian wolf or Tasmanian tiger. I actually hate the name Tasmanian tiger, because this animal here is a wonderful example of convergent evolution. It's a marsupial. It's related to things like the fat-tailed dunnart and the Tasmanian devil, and more distantly to kangaroos. It raises its young in a pouch. Looking at it, you'd think it was a member of the dog family, but it's not. It's a marsupial. And convergent evolution is when two entirely different species, not related at all and often living on different sides of the world, evolve to resemble each other because they are inhabiting similar ecological niches. They are doing similar things. So evolution puts similar pressures on them and they look alike. Now this creature, you see, it's got very wide jaws. It could open its jaws much wider than a placental wolf, and it had a much more powerful bite than a wolf, but its skull was not as well adapted for hanging on to struggling prey, because wolves hunt in packs. They grab big things like bison and they all hang on and start to eat it alive. whereas the Tasmanian wolf was a solitary hunter, and it would hunt things like kangaroos and wombats, and it would deliver a bite and then the prey would hemorrhage to death, so it didn't have to hang on while it was struggling about. Now, they used to live in New Guinea, mainland Australia and Tasmania. They were thought to have been wiped out in the mainland around about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, possibly through diseases brought in by the dingo, which was brought in by Australian Aborigines, which of course is a placental, a true dog. But it hung on until in Tasmania, but when the white man got to Tasmania, he set about killing the Tasmanian Aborigines, wiping out the Tasmanian emu, and bringing sheep over. And the Tasmanian wolf was blamed for killing sheep, sometimes ridiculous numbers of sheep that they could never have physically killed in one night. But there were several bounties put on it, and it was snared, poisoned and shot. And it was thought that the last one died in Hobart Zoo in the mid-1930s. Since then, there have been over 4,000 sightings in not only Tasmania, but also on mainland Australia, and very interestingly, in the mountains of New Guinea, where they call it Dobsonga. And it's not just laymen that's seeing this. A zoologist called Hans Narding had a very close-up view of one of these things in the early 80s, and we'll be talking more about that later on. Next one, please. Another category is known animals that have got very, very large, much larger than we think, or much larger than the textbooks say they should. There's something I've always found rather silly, is that mainstream zoologists will often state the largest animal measured by an expert as being the limit to what an animal can grow to. No, that's just the limit that we know about, the limit that's been measured. There's nothing to say that they can't get bigger. And we see this with crocodiles. There are stories of immensely big crocodiles, sometimes measured by very, very reliable witnesses, such as the German zoologist Hans Besser. And one of the most famous giant animals is the giant anaconda. And the biggest measured anaconda was about 27 feet, but there have been persistent rumours, unproven but persistent rumours and sightings of anacondas in the depths of tropical South America, growing to 45, 50 and even 60 feet long. That's a 60-foot tube of muscle, and I'm not talking about the contents of my pants. Can we have the next one, please? The creature I'm probably linked with the most is from the Indonesian island of Sumatra, and it's called the orang pendek. The name means short man in Malay, and ever since the time of the first Dutch settlers, there have been sightings of this creature, and the native people knew about it for centuries before. It's said to be 3 to 5 feet tall, but very muscular, immensely strong, sometimes said to have long hair on the head, strikingly human-looking face, upright walking, but with a divergent big toe in the tracks. The native people in Sumatra go in great fear of it, not because it's aggressive, but because it's immensely strong. It's not just natives that have seen it. Debbie Marta, who is now retired but was once the head of the Indonesian Tiger Conservation Group, saw the orang pendek on 4 different occasions. The wildlife photographer Jeremy Holden has also seen one of these things. Can we have the next slide, please? I've taken 6 expeditions now to the jungles of Sumatra. The earlier ones concentrated on Kerinci Sablat National Park and a place called Gunung Tujuh, the Lake of 7 Peaks, which is a deep lake in the caldera of an extinct volcano. That's us crossing the lake on these ancient rickety old canoes that they had. I'm sure these canoes came off the ark. They were so bloody rickety, and we were constantly having to bail them out with bowls, chucking the water out, and they had a consistency like polystyrene, and they were there for years, but we always thought we were going to sink, but we never did. The next one, please. That's one of the footprints we took around Gunung Every time I've been there, I've heard the creature calling, and I've found footprints and handprints. That there you can see the very broad heel, which is unlike most other apes, which suggests weight bearing for an upright walking animal. It's not on all fours like most apes are. You can see the offset big toe at the bottom, which is typically ape-like, and the four toes at the front. We've spoken to many witnesses, and members of the expedition have also seen the creature itself. A guy called Dave Archer that came on one of our expeditions, his first expedition, his first day on the jungle, he was there with our guide Sahar Dimas and a guy called Adam Davis, and he saw the orang pendek in a tree, and he said it was hanging onto the tree, obviously trying not to be seen, and it had a frightened look on its face because it realised there were humans in the area. And he said the fur reminded me of a mountain gorilla, and it was about the size of a big male chimpanzee, but it walked erect. It climbed down out of the tree when it realised it'd been seen and walked away on its hind legs. When we took this plaster cast here, we also found hair in the area, and the hair was sent to a colleague of ours called Lars Thomas, who is a Danish biologist linked with Copenhagen University. And he's an expert in mammal hair, and he looked at the structure of the hair. The DNA was too degraded to use, but he said this is related to but distinct from the Sumatran orangutan. It is a new species of primate. And it comes in a variety of colours. Most of the sightings talk about a dark coloured animal, very dark grey or black, but there are reddish brown individuals, and even sort of a yellowish honey-coloured individual, which is what Debbie Marta saw. I remember one time we were up at a village near Gunung Tuju making a documentary, and we got people in from the villages from miles around, and we talked to about 24 of them that had seen orang pendek or seen its tracks, and all of these stories were consistent. So apart from the Tasmanian wolf, the orang pendek is probably the cryptid that is closest to being seen. The last time I was in Sumatra, which was 2022, we found that the bureaucracy had been dialed up to 11, and now they'd cottoned on to people wanting to go into national parks, and they were charging you extortionate amounts. And if you wanted to take cameras in, it'd be even more. So we had to concentrate on jungle areas that were outside of national parks. But we still got lots of sightings. And in one area we were walking. We'd been putting up camera traps in the jungle. We were walking back through the jungle, and we heard this vocalization. And do any of you remember a rather blandly animated, very preachy and a bit camp cartoon called He-Man and the Masters of the Universe? Does anybody remember that? Do you remember the villain Skeletor? Do you remember his laugh, his high-pitched laugh? It sounded exactly like that. And now this sounds stupid, but it sounded like that. And our guide, our new guide, Dali, sadly Sahar Dimas, who was also a tiger shaman, he could do this ritual when he'd bring down the spirit of the tiger into him and become possessed by the tiger. Sadly, he passed away. But with our new guide, Dali, he said, "That's orang pendek, I've heard it before." And myself and another guy on the expedition all heard it. We heard it call 3 times from behind a stand of bamboo, which was about as far away from me as those doors over there. And my friend said, "Get your camera out, I'll run round, scare it towards you, you film it." I got my camera out, got it running. He went around, and he caught the briefest glimpse of it. And instead of running around the stand of bamboo, it took off at an angle straight into the jungle. So if I'd have just picked up my camera, followed the sound of that vocalization, I might have got it on film. Can we have the next one, please? That is one from a previous expedition. That is the hand. You can see the thumb there and the fingers. It's making a sort of like that with its hand. We found this near a rotten log where it braced itself on the floor and flipped the log over looking for insect larvae. They eat mainly plants, but they also take insect larvae and grubs and things like that. It's not like the hand of an orangutan, it's more like the hand of a small gorilla. It's got a larger thumb and thicker sausage-like fingers. Next one, please. That is the world's biggest flower, the Titan arum. That guy there was one of the orang pendek witnesses. He lived locally in the jungle, and one morning he'd gone out to go into the jungle and saw this thing standing in long grass, and he said it was about 4 feet tall, had a monkey-like face, long dark hair, and he was very frightened of it, and it made this strange noise. But as luck would have it, on this particular expedition, the Titan arum, the world's largest flower, was in bloom. They bloom for a couple of weeks every 14 years, then die. And they stink of rotting flesh because they attract flies rather than bees to pollinate them. And it's an enormous great thing, about 7 feet tall. It was absolutely spectacular. Next one, please. That's Debbie Marta, who I mentioned earlier. She's retired now, but she was a travel writer, and she stopped off in Sumatra, heard these stories about the orang pendek, thought it was just a little bit of local colour, didn't think anything of it. Then later, her guide, when she asked him what animals live around Gunung Tuju, he said, there are rhino, elephant, sun bear, gibbons and orang pendek. And she says, isn't that a legend? And he says, no, I've seen it. It's rare, but it's there. And just about a month later, she had her first sighting. She's retired now, but she used to run the Indonesian Tiger Conservation Group. Can we have the next one, please? That was some of the hair that was examined by Lars Thomas and shown to be from an unknown primate. Unfortunately, it was sent on for DNA analysis. They couldn't get any DNA out of it because the DNA was too damaged, but it was destroyed when they tried to get DNA out of it at Copenhagen University. It was a team led by a guy called Dr. Tom Gilbert. The next one, please. That is us with the Kubu people, and the Kubu people were the original inhabitants of Sumatra. Most of the people in Sumatra now are descended from the Malay people, but these were there centuries before. They're Negritos, so they are taller than the Asian people with curly hair, and until recently they lived completely in the forest. They didn't have any bows and arrows, they just had spears, and they lived a complete Aboriginal lifestyle. The guy at the back is called Nylam, who is their chief, and he told us that he was out hunting with some men once, and they heard something coming through the jungle, so they got up into a tree, and into the clearing stepped an adult male orang pendek with black hair that had a reddish tint to it, and he said it was there for a while, looking around as if it could smell them, but it couldn't see them because they were hiding up a tree, and finally it moved on again. Next one, please. This guy here was called Pak N, and on our second expedition he took us down to Lost Valley. Debbie Marta had shown us on this map this particular valley. She said no one's ever been down there, nobody knows what's down there, it's just on the map. So we decided, right, we're going to go down there. On our second expedition we went down to this place in the jungle. We couldn't even find natives that had been down there, except this one old guy who had been down there in his youth. He'd seen the orang pendek as well. He said he was walking through the jungle one day and he saw this thing walking towards him. He said it was so muscular and bulky it reminded him of Mike Tyson. And it was walking on its hind legs, had brown fur. As soon as it saw him, it turned and walked the other way. But we came to this chasm that was 500 feet deep, with sort of slope like that, and we didn't have any ropes, but we're English, so we got down there anyway. We just said, sod it. And we went down into this great chasm that apparently no Westerner has ever been in before. And we stayed there for a while. And it was quite a feeling to step out onto a place where no European has ever set foot on. ever before. Pretty amazing. But I thought orang pendek's going to have more sense than to come down here anyway. It's a lot of effort and there's not much food down there. Can we have the next one, please? There we are. There's us, myself and some of the team members and one of our guides, John, down in the Lost Valley. And if you look there, that's how steep the walls were, and we had to get up and down them with no ropes. Next one, please. This is Mongolia. This is the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, where we went hunting the Mongolian death worm. And it is one of the strangest and most alien places that I've ever been to in my life. Parts of it are sandy, like you expect a desert to be. Other parts are rocky and look like the surface of Mars, and all red. Other parts of it look like giant trays of cat litter going off into infinity. And there's even a place they call the Mirror, where there are chips of mica everywhere, so everywhere is reflective. Whilst we were there, we saw mirages that looked like minarets and lakes and things, and they were just caused by heat haze. There was one time we were at a remote oasis and we were looking out over the desert and we saw a dust devil building in the desert, and it got bigger and bigger and nearer, and it grew into a tornado that actually ripped through the camp. And I remember clinging onto one of the vehicles we had and looking up like Dorothy at the Wizard of Oz, looking up into the eye of the tornado, seeing one of our drivers 15 feet in the air hanging onto a shredded tent going round and round and round. It's an amazing place. There was an area called Long Red Mountain, so called because it's long, red and a mountain, and we were told to look out for dinosaur eggs there because some German tourists had found fossilised dinosaur eggs. As I was looking about, I saw a perfect fossilised egg, about the size of a hen's egg, but more lozenge shaped. You could even see the little cracks in it. I thought, what are the chances of finding one of those? I'll pick this up, take it back to the capital, back to Ulaanbaatar, and give it to the Natural History Museum. I picked it up and it disintegrated in my hand because it was desiccated camel shit. Can we have the next? That's Wall Canyon, another one of these oases we went to. We travelled for about 1,000 miles through the desert, and we must have talked to about 24 witnesses, and they were all describing the same thing. They described a scaly animal looking a bit like a salami or a draft excluder, about the length of a human arm, about as thick as a human arm. They're terrified of it. It can throw a whole area into a mad panic. They're so scared of it. One guy we talked to had seen it when he was tending camels and goats as a kid. He told he just saw it lying in the desert. He told his parents were so scared that they packed up their gur, the circular tents they have, and moved out of the area. When there's a death worm sighting, a whole community will sometimes move. We talked to old men that had seen it back in the 60s, back in the 30s, and younger people who had seen it just the year before we were there, which was 2005. We talked to a retired army colonel in an old base near the borders with China. He said he'd been out one day on his motorbike at dawn and he'd seen the creature lying in a sand dune, and he'd watched it for ages but it didn't move. He thought it was a piece of tyre initially, and he said there was dew on its back and the scales were glistening, and he says that's where he thinks the legend of electricity comes from, that they can kill with electricity. They call it throwing lightning, but all the people we spoke to said that's just folklore, it doesn't do that, but they believe it can spit and it's dangerous. We talked to one guy who'd seen it emerge from a hole and grab a mouse and eat the mouse. Another guy told us that he had killed one by throwing a stone at it back in the 60s, and some Russian scientists who had been looking for snakes picked the body up and took it away. So there could be a specimen in a jar somewhere, forgotten in some cupboard or basement in a Russian museum. In one area, they're very, very hospitable in the Gobi, and we stayed overnight in a ger once with some people, some witnesses, and they were giving us fermented camel's milk as a drink, which is a bit like fizzy semi-alcoholic yogurt. And the next day I went out to look for the death worm in a Saxel forest where this old woman had seen one, and suddenly my stomach started to heave and rumble, and suddenly a sandstorm came. And sandstorms, if you've never been in them, they're like aggressive fog, aggressive abrasive fog, and I ended up having explosive diarrhea in a sandstorm, which is not much fun. Can we have the next one, please? In one area there was a frozen river that's at the bottom of a gorge that hardly ever thaws because of where it is, and there are these ice caves that have been carved out by the wind, and we went into these ice caves. They're absolutely amazing. And the next one, please. That's another view of the Gobi Desert, just to see how desolate it was. After interviewing loads of witnesses, we came to the conclusion that the death worm is some sort of reptile. It's either a small constricting snake called a sand boa, or it's one of a group of reptiles called amphisbaenas, or worm lizards, which are these sausage-shaped burrowing reptiles. They're not snakes, they're not lizards, but they're related to both of them. But they're in a little group of their own. Whatever it is, it's unknown to science. And the powers ascribed to it are probably apocryphal. Next one, please. It's another view of the desert. They got covered in ticks as well. I've been accused on various times by people of just doing this because I want expensive, nice foreign holidays. I've been almost swept away by rapids, fallen down a crevasse, nearly fallen off a cliff, been attacked by a cobra, stalked by a tiger in Sumatra, being covered in leeches. One time in Sumatra, between three of us around the campfire at night, we picked 100 leeches off each other's legs. And in the Gobi Desert, we were covered with ticks. My mate John Hare, who was the guy just then in the ice cave, he even had one of them attach itself to its bollocks. So these are hard graft. They're not nice foreign holidays. If I wanted a nice foreign holiday, I'd be in somewhere like Singapore, surrounded by pretty girls. Can we have the next one, please? That's our camp in the Gobi Desert. That was before it got shredded by a whirlwind. Next one, please. We're back to Tasmania. I've been down to Tasmania 3 times now with my good friend, the Aussie Mike Williams, and other people like Tony Healy, Rebecca Lang, searching for this creature, and I'm convinced it's still around. It's one of the most iconic, inverted commas, extinct animals. But there's a lot of iconic extinct animals. The dodo, the passenger pigeon, the great auk, the Carolina parakeet. Nobody reports seeing them because they're extinct. Every single year there are reports of the Tasmanian wolf. And I think that's because the Tasmanian wolf is not extinct. Elusive, yes, but not extinct. Next one, please. This is a lady from the Tasmanian Tiger Bar. She's the landlady. Her name's Ramona, and she saw this animal. She was driving along one night, and you saw it lope out in front of her, and she got it in the headlights of her car, and she said it was unmistakable. She saw the stripes along the back and the long tail, and the gait, the long stiff tail, almost like a kangaroo's, and the gait of the Tasmanian wolf is different from the gait of a dog. She said it had a totally different, almost awkward gait to it. It sort of had this rocking, strange rocking gait to it, and she was sure that what she'd seen was a Tasmanian wolf. And then a couple of weeks later, 2 French girls who were staying at the hotel they run in almost exactly the same area, they saw the same thing. Tasmanian wolf bounding across the road in front of them. Can we have the next one, please? That gives you some idea of what the forests of Tasmania look like. They're very, very thick. If you go a few yards off the road, you can't see your hand in front of your face. And Tasmania is about the size of Ireland. Its population is less than 500,000, and most of them live in the 2 main cities of Hobart and Launceston. A city in Tasmania is more like a large town. A town is like a village is like a hamlet. And if you go to the west of the island, there are huge tracts of wilderness. And once again, we spoke to many witnesses. One guy, sadly passed away now, one old guy, had seen one of these things in the 1970s, about 1975. He worked on a hydroelectric scheme, and he was one of 5 people in a car driving to work one morning, and he saw the Tasmanian wolf in the middle of the road in front of them, and they all saw it. Multiple witnesses saw it, and he said it wasn't a fox, it wasn't a dog, there was no doubt what it was a Tasmanian wolf, and he said it was an absolutely beautiful animal. Next one, please. And what we would do, we'd set up camera traps and we would bait them. We actually found that chicken dead in the road. We didn't buy it ourselves, but you know, we would buy meat and use roadkill as well, and try and photograph animals with camera traps. The next one, please. This is another witness. He ran an arboretum, which, if you watch The Simpsons, you'll know is a tree place. He wrote this beautiful arboretum, and he had been over there since the 60s, and a few years before he'd been driving from Launceston from Hobart to Launceston, and he'd seen a Tasmanian wolf. Him and his wife had seen a Tasmanian wolf by the side of the road, and it was running along the side of the road trying to get under a barbed wire fence, and another car behind them had stopped, and they saw it as well. And he said subsequently there was a story in the local newspaper, so these other people must have reported it to the newspaper. Next one, please. This guy here is a government licensed shooter. He goes out and controls feral cats in Tasmania, which are a bloody menace. One of the very few animals that I don't like, along with the chimpanzee, is the domestic cat. Whenever it gets out anywhere, it decimates small mammals and birds. Case in point, the Stevenson's Island wren, a species of small flightless wren from an island off the coast of, between the 2 main islands of New Zealand. They opened a lighthouse there. Lighthouse keeper brought a cat. It killed every last one of them. Every last individual of that species was killed by a cat. And in places like Hawaii, they have decimated the local wildlife. So he goes out and blows the moggies away. And he goes right into the bush. He's seen the Tasmanian wolf twice, once from a car and once on foot. And he also spoke to a logger that had seen it as well. Next one, please. There's Mike there in the black t-shirt. That other guy is called John McGowan. He's from Dorset. He runs a natural history museum. He's a taxidermist, and he also lives off roadkill. He's one of those people that drives around getting deer and badgers and things that have been knocked down on the road and eating them. That's a Bennett's wallaby there. And that had been killed by a car, and he chopped it up, and some of it we ate on the barbie, and some of it we used for baiting the old Tassie wolf. We got lots of Tasmanian devils, lots of quolls, but His Majesty eluded us. Next one, please. That guy there has got the wonderful name of Grenville Batty. And Grenville Batty is the great nephew of Wilf Batty, who shot the last wild Tasmanian wolf we know about. and he says he thinks it's still around. On one occasion, more than one occasion, he's heard this high spasmodic triple yap. And a lot of people we spoke to say that the Tasmanian wolf has this high yap that goes yap, yap, yap very quickly, different to a fox. One of the park rangers we talked to said he'd heard it several times as well, and he thought it was a Tassie wolf. But this guy on one of our expeditions, he said, instead of camping, I've got this shack you can use in the outback. You can use my shack. We thought he meant a shed. So he thought, thanks, Granville. It was a whole house. He said, it hasn't got any electricity. That's because he hadn't switched the generator on. So we had a whole house to ourselves, Mike and myself, and we used it as a base for going out and looking for the Tassie wolf instead of camping, because I hate camping. I have to do a lot of camping on these things. Why anybody camps for pleasure is beyond me. God knows, you must be mad. It's uncomfortable, it gives you piles, you can't get a good night's sleep. Anyway, I digress. Next one, please. We were sponsored by Toyota on a couple of these, in so much as they gave us Land Cruisers and a special card for free petrol, which was very good of them. And we use these Land Cruisers to go all over the west of Australia. That's the skull of a Tasmanian wolf. And one of the ways you can tell it's not a wolf skull or a dog skull, that the dental formula is different, but it can open its jaws much wider than a wolf or a dog. And that's for fitting things like the chest of a big kangaroo or a wombat in its gob, so it can crunch down on it and rip away the flesh. And it was fond of eating soft flesh, the highly vasculated organs like the heart, the lungs and things like that. And it would often leave the bones and stuff for the scavenging Tasmanian devils. And a lot of kills that we've been told about were kills where there's a hole in the prey and it's all been gutted, as if something's come in and taken all of the soft organs. Next one, please. That's us in the take no notice of the camera date screwed up. Take no notice of that. That's Mike there in the outback of Tasmania. It gives you some idea of the terrain we're dealing with. The old Bushmen who used to be around when the creature officially existed, a lot of them fought in the Boer War, and they said that the Tasmanian wolf had a smell to it similar to a hyena. And in fact, some of them called it the hyena. There's a place called Hyena Hill in Tasmania. And I used to be a zookeeper. I worked at Twycross Zoo, where they have the PG-tips chimps. And I work mainly with reptiles, but I work with a bit of everything over the years. And I know what a hyena smells like. One time I was walking through a remote area of Tasmania down a little trail in the forest, and I got a smell exactly like that of a hyena, as if something had just come past a few moments before I'd left this lingering smell. Was it a Tasmanian wolf? I'll never know. But if I had to put money on one of these things actually existing, the Tasmanian wolf is the pony to back, with the orang pendek close behind. Next one, please. The giant anaconda. That is an alleged photograph of a giant anaconda floating in a river, one of the tributaries of the Amazon. It was supposed to have been machine gunned to death after it attacked some soldiers. Now, it's an anaconda, I can tell that from the markings. It seems to be bloated up with gas. It's dead, floating upside down. We don't know how big it is because we haven't really got a frame of reference. We don't know how far the camera was from it or how far away that bank is, but it does look big. And there are stories of anaconda growing to fantastic sizes. One of the few times we got sponsorship from the games company Capcom. for their Monster Hunter series, and they wanted us to do something on the back of that so they could advertise the Monster Hunter game. So we decided to go to Guyana in South America to look for the giant anaconda. Unfortunately, they wanted us to go in October because that's when they brought the game out, and it was the middle of the dry season. Can we have the next photograph, please? Our guide was a man called Damon Corrie, who is the hereditary chief of the Eagle Clan Arawak tribe, and he told us how he met some hunters in a remote place called Corona Falls, and they'd been terrified at the sight of this giant anaconda, and he said, how big was it? And they pointed to a fallen tree. They pointed to a palm tree that was about 30 feet tall, and they said there was a dead, fallen palm tree in the swamp where we saw it, and it crawled past it. It was the same size as that, and its head and neck was protruding over one part of it, and its tail over the other, which meant that it was a minimum of 40 feet long. Unfortunately, when we went, it was in the middle of the worst drought in living memory. Not even the natives could remember a drought that bad. We couldn't get out to Corona Falls because the rivers were so low and no boats could take us. So we were out here on the grasslands. We weren't in the jungle, we were on these swampy grasslands. That is my friend Dr. Chris Clark. That is the trail of an anaconda going past him. That is an average sized anaconda, maybe 16 feet long. Can we have the next one, please? That's Damon Corrie, our native guide. Really nice guy. He doesn't always go around looking like that, but he lived in a little village called Letham, which we stayed in before we went out into the wilderness. This was the toughest expedition I've ever done. Usually I can cope with the heat, it's cold that gets me, but out here there was no, because it wasn't a rainforest, it was a savanna, there was no shelter, so it was murderously hot, and we were collapsing through heat stroke. It was terrible, and we got torn apart by insects. There's one photograph which I mercifully am not showing, which shows my arse after it's been bitten by vine flies. My girlfriend photographed it, and it looks like a giant diseased strawberry grown at Sellafield. Can we have the next one, please? There's another trail in the grasslands of an anaconda. It's weird though that when you go looking for one thing, you'll hear about other things as well. In Guyana, there's a tradition of a creature called the Dai, which is similar to a yeti or a Bigfoot. It's a type of hairy wild man. And the native people, the actual native Guyana people, get a very bad rap. They're very much third-class citizens after the blacks, the Indians, and the other immigrants. And nobody really cares about them. And he said a few years before, at the next village along from Letham, two kids were walking home from school when out of a stand of trees comes this huge, hairy, man-like creature, grabs the girl, makes off with her. She's never seen again, and the police wouldn't even investigate it. We also heard stories of a race of pygmies, an unidentified race of pygmies that paint their face red, and they're about 3 feet tall. Everywhere we went, we met people that had seen these. Damon had seen one as well. He said one morning he was camping and this thing unzipped his tent and just looked in, curious, and he had this weird grin on its face. Everywhere we went, we heard stories of the red-faced pygmies, and they're a totally unidentified race. Whether they're pygmy human beings or some sort of hominin, we've got no idea. But the giant anaconda eluded us because we couldn't get into the very remote places where it's supposed to be. The gauchos, the South American cowboys, they named it the Manatoro, the bull killer, because they say it's so large it can grab a full-grown bull, whip its coils around it, constrict it, and swallow it whole in the way that a boa constrictor would swallow a rat. Can we have the next one, please? That's a skull from the burial of a shaman in the mountains of Guyana. It's one of the things he showed us, and the shaman was buried in this like huge earthenware pot, and a child was sacrificed to go with him, and there were beads and stuff. And when you go and see, you call it meeting the shaman, and it's hundreds of years old. You have to take tobacco as an offering, and you have to smoke. I mean, I don't smoke, I think it's a filthy habit, but even I took a puff on the tobacco, and you blow it as an offering to the shaman in the mountains. Next one, please. This guy here, we met him on a ranch. I can't remember his name now, but we met him on a ranch. He was a real-life cannibal, and he's a really nice guy, actually. And what had happened is that there'd been a plane crash in the mountains, and this microlight plane with the pilot had gone down in the mountains, and the parents of this guy asked this man to go up into the mountains and try and find the body and bring it back. And there's loads of mythology attached to these mountains. All sorts of weird things are supposed to happen up there. He got lost when the mists come down. He found the body, and it had been burnt terribly in the fire, so he put it in a sling. He was coming back down, got hopelessly lost, and he was up there for days and days with no food, and he had to eat part of the body. He ate the arm of this crash victim who had been burnt in the fire. So what he told the parents when he finally got down, I don't know, but he was a real-life cannibal. That's just a picture of me looking very haggard and dehydrated in the wilds of Guyana.
They're coming out quite dark on the screen, which are quite bright on the laptop.
So trekking through the wilderness.
I want to make the pictures bigger because they're a bit smaller earlier on, so I'll always swap them.
I have never known such murderous heat as there was in Guyana. And the next one, please. I mentioned earlier about the Russian group, the Snowman Commission. And one of the expeditions we did was to the Caucasus Mountains, where Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann did her research in search of the Russian wild man, or almasty. The almasty is not as massive as the yeti or the Sasquatch. It ranges from about 5.5 to 7.5 feet tall. It's notably more human looking. It's hairy but less hairy, and has a more human-like face. Can we have the next picture, please? There's some hominin reconstructions that look very like the Russian wild man, the almasty. Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann collected decades worth of reports of these from local people, and they didn't seem to think anything of them. They didn't think they were anything particularly fantastic, which was what we found when we went to the Caucasus Mountains as well. Can we have the next one, please? This gentleman here is called Gregory Panchenko, and he is a Ukrainian biologist. He lives in Germany now, but he grew up at the time of the Soviet Union. He was involved in sort of Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann's later excursions and did his own research as well. And he acted as our guide. He had his own encounter with the almasty in a barn on a farm, where the farmer said that at night something was coming in and plaiting the mane of an elderly mare that he had stabled up in the barn, and he thought it was an almasty. So Gregory put some food out for this thing in the barn and hid himself in some hay and waited for it. Unfortunately, fell asleep. When he woke up, it was at night and the moonlight was coming in, and there was a hatch up in the wall of the barn. It was open, and he noticed the food had gone, and standing next to the mare was a young almasty, which he said was covered with grey hair. He only saw it from the back. It was covered with long grey hair, and it was playing with the mane of the horse and making a smacking noise with its mouth, like that. And then when it had sufficiently entertained itself, it leapt up onto a beam in the barn and ran through the out through the hatch. And he's a biologist, and he was within 10 feet of it. There were many other stories we heard about. The almasty is not afraid to approach human habitation in search of food. There's one story we heard about an almasty that went into a farm, killed a guard dog with a club, and made off with a big cheese, a big Bulgarian cheese. Another farmer had seen one of these things near a silo of grain and threw a rock at it, where the almasty picked up a massive rock and hurled it back at him. And one of the things we did, can we have the next slide please? These are the mountains of the Caucasus where we were. One of the things we did was stake out an old abandoned hut that had been abandoned in 1974, I think, after the farmer had been murdered by some of his relatives because they thought he was hoarding money, and then his wife was killed as well, and one of the robbers was killed, and the other one was escaped and was caught by the police, but it was been abandoned ever since. And a few years before, some shepherds were just hanging out at twilight on the veranda of this old farmhouse when the door at the end of the veranda swung open and a 7-foot almasty was there. It walked along the veranda, picked one man up, just moved him out of the way gently, got to the end of the veranda, jumped off and disappeared into the forest. We staked it out because we'd heard there was a lot of sightings around there. Another one of the team that went with us, because we were a Ukrainian, a mix of Ukrainians, one Russian and the rest was English. And we staked out, some of us staked out this old farmhouse, and one of the Ukrainians was an archaeologist called Anatoly Serendenko, and he had seen a 7-foot almasty walking through the long grass several years before around this old abandoned farmhouse. So we heard that most of the action took place around about 10 o'clock at night, then it would peter out, and then about 2:30 in the morning you'd get another bout of it for some reason. So we put out bait, red wine, honey, cherries, meat. We set up camera traps. And we'd heard from several witnesses that the almasty makes this smacking noise with its mouth, but it also twitters like a bird. So, if you can imagine, this old farmhouse consisted of 3 rooms with no connecting doors to them, but a L-shaped veranda that runs around them. It was 1 story high. We were staking it out. About 10 o'clock at night, I hear a twittering noise. It was dark, so there should be no birds around. One of the camera traps goes off, and I think, ha-ha, could this be what I think it is? Then nothing else happens. And it gets to about 2 o'clock in the morning, it's getting very cold, so we decide to go and warm ourselves around this old-fashioned range they'd got in this farm, where we put some wood in and set fire to it. One of my mates, Dave Archer, the guy who saw the orang pendek, he fell asleep on this manky old mattress, and myself and this other cryptozoologist called Adam Davis were sitting there warming ourselves around the range. And the door into this room was about 7 feet tall, a big wooden door. It was slightly ajar, and there was moonlight and starlight streaming in. Suddenly, from outside, we hear a guttural vocalisation that sort of goes boom, 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 boom. Sounds like something with big lungs and a big chest made it. And it's not any animal that I recognise. It's not an eagle owl or a bear or a wolf or anything like that, or a wild boar. And I said to Adam, did you hear that? And he said, yes. About 25 seconds later, something walks along the veranda, and as it walks past this open, partially open door, I mean, it was only a couple of inches ajar, it blocks out the moonlight and the starlight to a height of 7 foot plus. So whatever it was standing on its hind legs, and it was over 7 feet tall. Now, bears can stand and move on their hind legs, but it's a threat posture, or they want to look around. They don't habitually move for a long way on their hind legs, and they make a terrible noise with their claws. Whatever this was swift and silent as a cat. And I said to Adam, it's out there on the veranda. We grab our cameras and we run out onto the veranda to find nothing but darkness and silence. Whatever it was had disappeared into the night, and nothing further happened that night. So what we did in the morning is check the camera traps, but the only images what they got were vegetation moving about. Now, were we 12 foot away from an almasty, a possible relic hominin? Well, I'd be a liar if I said I knew that I was for sure, but it was too tall to be a man, it was too swift and silent to be a bear. I don't know what else it could have been. Can we have the next? This is the sort of terrain and the forests you get in the Caucasus mountains. And we met a number of people there that had seen it. We met the deputy head of Albarus National Park, who's a doctor of geological science. He had been out looking for lost sheep, and he saw this thing lying on the floor at twilight that he thought was a cow. And then suddenly it stood up, and it was shaped like a man, but it was huge, and it started to walk away up the mountain, and he realised that it was an almasty. We talked to an old couple, and the woman had seen an almasty in Kazakhstan shortly after World War II, and she said she'd gone around to her friend's house and found that her friend and a bunch of children were inside very frightened and crying, and they said, and she said, what's the matter? And she said, there's a monster outside of the house. And she looked out through the window. It wasn't like a glass window, it was a wooden window that you open up, a wooden door inside of the house. And she said she saw this thing covered in long hair, and she said that it had a mane of hair over its face. It was hanging down over its face. A description made me think of Cousin It from the Addams Family. I always preferred the Munsters by a long way. But anyway, but she said it was making this bird-like twittering noise and picking up mud and just slinging it at the house as if it was just entertaining itself in the way that an ape would do. And it was still there when she went away. The old man, he had seen one much more recently, and it had come into, it was a young one that had come into his backyard and was throwing stones at the house, and he interpreted it as wanting food, so he left bread out for it, and it took the bread. And he said he didn't get a good look at the face, but it was covered in long, dark hair, and its hand looked very like a human hand when it took the bread. Another guy was a guide who was taking some German tourists through the mountains, and they'd come across an old abandoned shack, and he saw a 7-foot almasty with dark hair. And he said it entered this old shack, and as it did so, it turned around and bared its teeth at them as it was threatening them not to come any closer. Originally, the Snowman Commission thought that the almasty was a degenerate surviving form of Neanderthal, but we now know much more about Neanderthals. Neanderthals were very sophisticated. They made art, they made fire, they made jewellery, they made clothes, they made sophisticated tools. They weren't very tall. The biggest Neanderthal was about my height, although very much more muscular, and they had great big conchs. If you saw a Neanderthal sideways on, he'd have a big nose like that, and that was for warming up air. breathing air through the nose and the blood vessels warm it up. And nothing like an almasty. Almasty is much bigger, it has a flat, more ape-like nose. Its tool use is very primitive, it doesn't have fire. I think if the almasty exists, it is liable to be either an early offshoot of Homo erectus, an early robust offshoot of Homo erectus, or a robust offshoot of Homo habilis. And we know from the fossil record that the ancestors and relatives of man, there are far more of them than we ever thought. New species are being found every year in the fossil record, and also there are genetic markers on certain groups of human beings, living human beings, that suggest that they mated with unknown species of hominin in the distant past, ones we haven't even got the bones for yet. We've only got the genetic ghosts of. Next one, please. That's us investigating a cave in the mountains. And the next one, that's Anatoly there bending down. He's the one who saw it near the shack. Next one, please. The year after, we went to India on the trail of the yeti. The yeti is probably the most misunderstood of all mystery animals. What colour would you think the yeti was if I asked you?
White.
No, there's never been an account of a white yeti. It comes from a mistranslation of the Sino-Tibetan name, Mito Kangme, which means abominable man of the rocks. It was mistranslated as abominable man of the snows, and that's where we get this false notion of a white creature from. There are many names for the yeti across the Himalayas, Tibet and India, and other regions as well, such as Malaya. In Tibet, they say there are three distinct types. There's the zute, which is the big one, which is 3 meters or more tall. There's the mete, which is more man-sized, and then there's the little temle, which is smaller, still about 3-4 feet tall. And they live in different areas, and they don't coexist with each other, so they're not the young of one species, they're a different type. In India they call it the Mande Barung, or the forest man, and it's a big kind, it's the big one, and this is the one we were after. Can we have the next one, please? The Garo Hills are in Meghalaya, which is in the north of India, and it's mountainous forest. Not unlike the jungles of the foothills of Tibet and Nepal. And one of the things we found was a footprint here. There was a trail of these. As you can see, the toes there and the heel at the back. This was a subadult. The guy we were with several local guides, one of which is a chap who's been hunting this creature for years, a journalist. He said he's seen footprints in the Garo Hills that are over 16 inches long, some of them over 18 inches. This one was about 12 inches, so it's a subadult. It's in mud, not snow. When the footprints are in snow, you can get an ordinary animal like a wolf or a bear or a monkey leave tracks, and they will partially thaw out, then freeze again, and then thaw out and become distorted. So the famous Shipton photographs may well be just of a bear that have been distorted as it's thawed and froze again. This is in mud, you don't get that in mud. There was a trail of these we followed through the jungle. They were about 12 inches long, and they sunk down deep into the mud, twice as deep as my tracks. At the time, I was what you scientifically term as a fat bastard. I was about 18 stone. I've lost a couple of stone. I'm still a fat bastard, but I'm not as much of a fat bastard as I was back then. Those prints were going twice as deep as mine into the mud. We followed them through the jungle, and whatever it was tipping over boulders that no man could move and eating freshwater crabs. We spoke to a number of witnesses. One man said that he'd seen one of these creatures. He described it as looking like a gorilla standing on its hind legs with long dark hair, and he'd seen it build a nest, much in the way that gorillas do. He was up on a hill looking downwards, and he'd seen this thing construct a huge nest, and it was there for about 3 days. Another guy said he'd heard these stories, thought they were nonsense, until he saw one. It was a female suckling a baby whilst eating bamboo, and even when she was sitting down, she was as tall as he was. We talked to village elders, because these were all hill tribes up in the mountains of Meghalaya. We talked to a tribal elder who had seen one when he was out collecting herbs and spices in the jungle, and he said it seemed to perform a threat ritual, a bit like a threat display, a bit like a gorilla, and it would roar and shake the trees, and he was very frightened of it. Can we have the next one, please? That's the team there, and behind us is this place called Nokrek Gorge, and nobody goes down there. It's this massive great gorge in the middle of the wilds of northern India, and virtually no one goes down there, and the local people say, we don't know what's down there. We didn't have time, unfortunately, to go all the way down there. We talked to one guy who said that years ago he'd seen a guy selling bushmeat, that's wild animals that are shot and sold for food, and he said he had an exhibit. He wasn't selling it, but it was an exhibit, and it was the preserved arm of a yeti, and he said it was the forearm, so from the elbow to the hand, and it was as long as his entire arm, and it had a hand like a human on it, and it was covered in grey fur, but it was very old and dry. Can we have the next one, please? One of the theories about the yeti is that it is this creature here, the one in the centre that's duffing up these little ones. That is Gigantopithecus blackeye. It's a giant ape. It lived up until about 100,000 years ago. It's only known from its teeth and jaws, but it seems to have been the biggest primate that ever lived, and it's been estimated that in life it would have been 10 feet tall. So it's a good match in size and shape for the yeti, and it lived in parts of China and India and Vietnam, so it's in the right general area. The wear on its teeth suggests that it ate mainly bamboo and tough fibrous plants, whereas the yeti seems to be more of a generalist. It's an omnivore. It will eat both plants and animals. There are stories from the Himalayas and Tibet of it using rocks to hurl at yaks to smash their skulls and then eat the yaks, or grab them by the horns and twist them and break their necks. But it seems to eat both plants and animals. So whether it is Gigantopithecus or it's something entirely different, we don't know. It's just a theory. Next one, please. That's a human skull, the skull of a gorilla, and the skull of Gigantopithecus blackeye, which gives you some idea of just how big it was. Is it the yeti, the yeren, the Sasquatch? We don't know. It's a contender. The next one, please. That's not another view of Nokrek Gorge, with these waterfalls falling down into it, and even the local people say, we don't know what's down there, we never go. You could hide herds of elephants down there, you'd never know about it. Next one, please. This is Siju Caves in India. They're the third largest cave system in India. We went exploring them because the chief of a local village said that he was down there once and he heard a terrible roar and thought it was the Mandai Barung, and then he found its footprints. And the next one, please. That's us in the caves. That's myself, Adam Davis in the middle with a fag on, and Dr. Chris Clark. Next one, please. We found part of a femur. We took it back for analysis. I thought it was too small to be from a yeti, at least an adult one, and it did indeed turn out to be part of a human femur. Next one, please. That's some of the rock formations in the cave. There's a big colony of fruit bats in there as well. And the next one, please. Those are the mountains of Tajikistan, which is a country in Central Asia. We went there twice, once in 2018 and again just a few weeks ago. I'm not long back from there. Can we have the next one, please? We were looking for two creatures there. One of them was the gull, a type of wild man. The name is Arabic. It's where we derive the word ghoul from. And in Arabic law, the ghoul is a pale, humanoid, undead creature that lives in the desert and emerges to eat human corpses. But in Tajikistan, the word is used for a hairy wild man. And we were also looking for the Caspian tiger. There are a number of species of tigers, and three of them, the Bali tiger, the Javan tiger and the Caspian tiger, are supposed to be extinct. The Caspian tiger last being seen for sure in the 1960s, rumours of them up until the 1990s. But we went into the wilds of the Romit Valley in Tajikistan and talked to the people that lived there. And we heard many stories of both the ghoul and the tiger. Next one, please. This man here is actually a biology teacher. He said that he had been out delivering hives one evening. Honey is a massive industry in Tajikistan. Everywhere you go, you see beekeepers and beehives. And when you go to people's houses, they'll give you a goblet of honey. They're mad for egg and chips as well for some reason. You might think you're in Yorkshire or somewhere, but they love egg and chips. Wherever you go in Tajikistan, they'll give you egg and chips. So this guy was a biology teacher, and he said he saw what he thought was a bear run out in front of his van. So he stopped to get a closer look at it. I mean, I wouldn't get out of a van in the middle of the night to look at a bear in the arse end of nowhere, but he did. And then he said it seemed to have gone, so he was walking back to his van when something grabbed a hold of him. And he described turning around to see this creature about 5.5 feet tall, so not massive like a yeti, face very like a monkey, very ugly, foul smelling, covered in long yellowish hair. It had thumbs further back on its hand than humans do, so its hand structure was different, and it grasped him, and it had long dangling breasts, so he thought it was a female, and he said he thought it wanted to mate with him. Sounds a bit like my ex, to be honest. And he struggled with it, managed to punch it, it let go, and he ran into his car and drove off. But he was a biology teacher. He said he'd also seen tigers in the mountains. Next one, please. This guy here said he was on a trip up to the far end of the Romit Valley, and they were cutting grass to use for browse for their animals. And he was camped out one night with the others, and they got a donkey tethered up outside. And he woke up and it was light, and he thought it was morning. And he heard the donkey braying, and he thought, what's wrong with the donkey? So he goes outside, finds it's moonlight. It's not morning, but it's just full moon and very light. And he sees one of these creatures, a ghoul, trying to strangle the donkey with the rope that it's been used to be tethered with. And he says, again, it's about 5.5 feet tall. It has these long arms. And all of them, they said, the first thing they tell you about it is its thumbs are weird. The thumbs are further back on the hand than a human being's. And when it saw him, it ran away. Again, he had also seen tigers in the mountains. Next one, please. We showed them lots of reconstructions of Yeti and Sasquatch, lots of reconstructions of prehistoric hominins and apes, and pictures of modern day apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees. All of them picked this, and it's the illustration from a very good book called The Beast of Boggy Creek by Lyle Blackburn, which is about skunk apes in North America, which are supposedly a subspecies of Sasquatch, which are smaller more foul smelling and more aggressive. But they said the thing they liked about that was the shape of the hands. They said it got the shape of the hands exactly right. Can we have the next one, please? There, you see a chimpanzee's hand in comparison to a human hand. You see what you mean. The thumb is smaller and placed further back on the hand. And this primitive hand structure is what the gull seems to have. Next one, please. This guy here was a beekeeper. He had never seen a gull, though his father had seen one. But he had seen the tiger. He'd seen a female tiger with a number of cubs earlier that year. And we met some imams in a local mosque that all told us that everybody knows there are tigers still here. They say that a tiger was killing livestock just the year before. They told us of a hunter that had shot a mountain goat and a tiger had come and taken his goat. We met another hunter who had seen another female tiger with young. We met a park ranger who'd seen a tiger just a month before we were there and observed it from only 100 feet away. We met many more people that had seen the gull. We met one man who worked in a mill, and he said that the water to the mill, which was from a stream, wasn't flowing properly. So he went out to check what was wrong, and he saw a male and a female gull sitting in the water of this stream, blocking it. And he said that when they saw him, they started hurling rocks at him. And he said the female was about 5.5 feet tall, and the male was about 7 feet tall. And he ran back to the mill in a panic, and they chased him, and they were banging on the doors. He locked the door, and they were jumping on running around on the roof. And the other guy who was with him, an older guy, says, "Don't worry, they'll go away. Leave it, and don't panic, they'll go away after a bit," which is what they did. Can we have the next one, please? That's the guy. That's the guy there who's told us that very story. And the next one, please. We set out camera traps, baited with various fruit, and we got bears. And the next one, please. And we got wild boar, but no wild men and no tigers. We returned to Tajikistan just a few weeks ago. We went to the Karatang Valley, which is a different valley to the Romit Valley, not so far east. We found that the people there, most of them knew about the gull, but they said it had long vanished from that area. One man said he'd seen it in 1988, this huge hair-covered creature. Another man said that an old man from his village saw it back in the 70s, and it shocked him so much he died of fright, and people went out to look for it, and they found tracks, and they came across 2 of these creatures that went back up into the mountains. Another man told a very similar story about tracks being found in the 70s, and then people going into the mountains and seeing a pair of these things together again that vanished off into the mountains. But most of them said these things sort of started to retreat in the 60s and 70s because more humans were coming into the Karatang Valley, and the last ones were seen in the 1980s. But the tiger was a different story. Everyone we spoke to had seen a tiger, and they said they come down from the mountains every year in winter to kill livestock and eat livestock. In summer, they said they stay up in the high altitudes. We met a man who had seen one. He was a village elder who had seen one just that year, earlier that year. Well, the year before, but last Christmas time, he had seen one from a distance of only 5 metres, and they all described these big striped cats always coming down in winter, always taking livestock and then vanishing in the spring back up into the mountains. So the Caspian tiger, which is thought to be extinct, is almost certainly still around. We went onto the Romit Valley again for just a few days, but an enormous storm came and drove us down out of the mountains, and at one point we thought the river was going to flood and we'd drown, but we were in the most enormous storm I've ever seen. I've seen some big storms in the tropics, nothing like this. It was unbelievable. It was apocalyptic, and it killed 21 people, and we were stuck right in the middle of it. Thankfully we were okay, but on the way back out of the Romit Valley, one of the bridges were down and we had to wait while they repaired it. So I'm convinced of the existence of the Caspian tiger into the modern day, and what we want to do in later times and subsequent expeditions is to get cameras with very powerful long-lasting batteries that are satellite linked, so you can download once a week all the photos they've taken, leave them up in the mountains, say in something like October, and leave them there over winter, over autumn and over winter, perhaps baited with meat, and see if the Caspian tiger turns up on any of these camera traps. One of the camera traps we set out in Sumatra when we were looking for the orang pendek caught a very rare Sumatran tiger in an area where they're not supposed to be. So you always get these strange things turning up on cameras. And what we found is the longer you leave a camera up, the more it's going to catch. We tested the cameras out in some woods in Devon, and we found if we left them up for a couple of weeks, they'd get a few birds. We leave them up for a couple of months, they get otters, badgers, deer, foxes, woodpeckers, and a woman having a piddle in the woods. So long-term camera trapping, I think, is the way forward for a lot of these things, as well as environmental DNA. So what's next? We don't know yet. There are several plans afoot. I want to return to Tasmania to look for the Tasmanian wolf again. I want to go to Irimoti Island, which is off the coast of southern Japan, where there's supposedly an undiscovered species of cat, maybe a dwarf island form of the clouded leopard. I want to go back to Mongolia for the death worm. We want to go back to Tajikistan for the Caspian tiger. I want to go looking for giant crocodiles, because there are stories of crocodiles all over the world. Nile crocodiles and saltwater crocodiles growing to fantastical sizes as long as buses, and some of them take on an almost mythological status. There's one along the Fly River in New Guinea that is sort of venerated as a water spirit. There's one in northern India, in Orissa in northern India. There's one in the Philippines called Potol, which is supposed to be bigger than the boats that go out onto the swamps. And then there's a legendary Gustav in Tanganyika, Lake Tanganyika in Africa, who's supposed to have eaten over 300 people. So that's another thing that I want to do. It's all down to the folding green stuff though. But basically that's an introduction to cryptozoology and what I do. I haven't touched on the supernatural side, which includes things like Owlman, Mothman, Jeff the Talking Mongoose, who I have experience with, and things like literal sightings of literal fire-breathing dragons in the modern day, which of course can't be a flesh and blood creature. It must be some sort of paranormal manifestation, but it doesn't make it any the less real. It's just a different type of real. But that's a different story for a different time. Tonight has been all flesh and blood real animals that we're looking for. So, has anybody got any questions, such as why is orange jam called marmalade? Why do people laugh at Mrs. Brown's boys? Why do working class people vote Conservative? Where do babies come from? And things like that. Questions?
Do you believe? Sorry. Do you believe in dogma?
As a flesh and blood animal, no. As a paranormal manifestation, possibly. The interesting thing about modern day sightings of werewolves, like the Beast of Bray Road and so forth, is that they have no relationship whatsoever to the old medieval European reports of werewolves. Because in Europe, the werewolf was a person, usually who was given a magical wolfskin belt or jacket that they would put on, and they would transform into a wolf, but entirely into a wolf. A wolf that was indistinguishable from any other wolf, except for perhaps by weird behaviour. So this man-wolf hybrid is a creation of Hollywood. really. It's like fairies being portrayed with wings. That was an invention of the Victorians, exasperated by the saccharine dog shit of Disney. So the dogman manifestations, if they're real or something paranormal, possibly something to do with the human mind, rather than a physical creature you could catch and put in a cage.
Don't you believe they're two different things, dogman and werewolf?
Well, the werewolves of ancient Europe were probably based on rabid wolves, because usually wolves keep out of people's way. A rabid wolf will become bold and savage and attack people, and it will bite them and then pass on the disease, which is possibly where rabies is possibly responsible for both werewolf and vampire legends. The dogman, the beast of prey road and things like that. And all this started, some of the earliest reports were from Northumberland in England with the Hexham Heads case, which where a wolfman turned up after 2 stone heads were unearthed in a garden, which turned out to have been made just after World War II and were meant to be Hitler and Mussolini. So they were not these ancient Celtic things that they were supposed to be originally. So it's a very strange, but I write about this in my new book, The Highest Strangeness, which should be out fairly soon. Any other questions?
I've got a question, and thank you. It's been really like my vocabulary has extended from everything that you've mentioned. But my question is, you went up to all these places, you mentioned about hybrids, you mentioned about genetic engineering, or genetics anyway. So, all these places that you mentioned, are there labs somewhere in these areas where engineering is taking place, genetic engineering, and this is why you're coming across all these creatures?
No.
No?
No. These are just animals, these are just creatures we don't know about. They're not genetic hybrids bred in a laboratory. They're animals we don't know about. They're undiscovered species of animal.
I don't know. We'll have to disagree, because I've done some research and it does it.
You don't get many laboratories in the jungles of Sumatra. You don't get many laboratories.
But that's where they would hide them, so you wouldn't find them
in the arse end of Mongolia, where there are no human beings for hundreds of miles around. There's absolutely no evidence that any of these things are human-made genetic hybrids. They're just weird animals we don't know about. Fella at the back.
So hearing some reports on these like Sasquatch-like creatures, some people will like talk about like almost extra-dimensional activity that is related to these experiences. Do you believe that these are strictly just flesh and blood creatures, or do you think they could possibly be something more to it?
Well, like I said before, there's 2 different categories. There's one category where there are flesh and blood animals, there's one where they appear to be, for want of a better word, paranormal. With Bigfoot and with the Australian Yowie, the waters are muddied because you get both. But it's not an either-or scenario. You could have 2 discrete phenomena. Now, the example I give is black dogs. You get sightings of demonic black dogs like Black Shuck, Bargest, Padfoot. Every county in Britain has them. But there are real big black dogs as well. So there could be a real Bigfoot, a flesh and blood Bigfoot, which I think there is. I think it's some sort of relic hominin. And you could have a phenomena that apes or mimics it. You get human beings and you get phantasms of human beings. So it's not that different, and that's what my new book is about, the Highest Strangeness, which is a departure from all the other stuff I've done, because it's about real batshit insane whacked out cases that no one would ever make up. And you've got things like sightings of living dragons and dragon worship cults sacrificing people to dragons. You've got the ghost in South Africa, a ghost that manifests as a giant glowing floating crab. You've got, you remember John Pertwee, the greatest doctor of them all? Back in the days of real Doctor Who, not the gender-flipped woke BBC dog shit of today. The real Doctor Who, when he was a boy, he had an encounter with a ghost that manifested as a crawling, glowing, green, bubbling tree stump that smelt of human sewage and rotting flesh. You've got Jeff the talking mongoose and a plethora of other talking animals, including a case in Liverpool where 2 kids met a tabby cat 4 times the size of what a cat should be, with human eyes, that spoke and warned them about a paedophile in the woods who turned out to be real. He'd been released from an institution and he was in the woods the kids were in, and this thing warned them about him, and it called itself Samael. Samael is a Hebrew demon, the venom of God, who is a fallen angel who punishes the wicked. 2 Scouse kids in 1959 are not going to know about that. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's all sorts of modern day sightings of trolls and fairies. God almighty, all sorts of really ultra weird, strange stuff. Bigfoot seen with UFOs, Bigfoot seen piloting UFOs, UFOs that open their doors, and instead of an alien coming out, demonic black dogs come out. Bloody hell, you name it, someone's seen it.
Can you tell them the story that you told me in the car about the rabbits in Liverpool? Again, Liverpool.
Oh, right. Yeah, there was this guy called Lee Walker, and Lee Walker, he's from Liverpool, one of the nicest blokes I've ever met, and he said, I'm not a researcher, I'm a collector of stories. I collect these stories and I put them down so they don't get lost. And he wrote a couple of books. What were they called? New Ferry After Midnight is one of them. And but if you look up Lee Walker and you type in New Ferry After Midnight, you'll get his other books as well. And he's a lovely, lovely bloke, and he used to come to the conferences we ran, the Weird Weekend, with these collections of weird stories he found. And he married this girl called Evie, went on holiday to South Africa, really excited about it, dropped down dead of a stroke in South Africa. And he's incredibly sad. But his legacy lives on. And he also recorded personal stories that happened to him as a boy. And one of them involved these rabbits that they got. They got a couple of pet rabbits, and they were told by the pet shop there were 2 females, but they weren't. There were a male and a female, so they got to shagging pretty quick. And the female had babies, so they had to rehome the male. And the female had all these babies, and they kept them in the backyard in a hutch with a big room. One morning they come down, one of the babies is dead, and its head is completely flattened, totally flat. And they thought, blimey, what's happened there? Is there some sort of predator like a weasel or a stoat got in? Why isn't it eating the body? So they take the body away. Next day, happens again. So they secure the enclosure more, and then it happens again. And they think, is it the female rabbit accidentally standing on the baby's head? So they separate the babies and the rabbit, the adult rabbit, and it's happening again and again until it gets to the last rabbit. The last rabbit they put in a hutch, which they put in their garden shed, and they put a brick on top of it. Lee's sister says she's worried about the rabbit. She's got a feeling this baby rabbit's in danger. She's going down to the shed to look at it. She comes running back, screaming, hysterical. When she calms down, she says she went into the shack, the shed rather, and she saw on the table in the shed where the hutch was, this figure about 3 feet tall in what looked like a monk's habit. But it turned to look at her, and she said it had great pointed ears, bloodshot eyes, these horrible snaggle teeth, and a big warty nose, and in its hand it was holding a lump hammer. And they all go tearing back down to the shed to find no goblin, but the brick taken off the hutch open, and the last baby rabbit with its head flattened. And that's just one of many, many stories of modern day fairies I've got. Fairies aren't these little sweet little things, they're at best neutral, and oftentimes in the same way dragons were dangerous. Any other questions? Anybody else? Oh, fella at the back there.
What's the weirdest thing that you've encountered?
Well, the weirdest thing I have encountered is not a monster. The weirdest thing I encountered happened the year 2000, and it was on Dartmoor in Devon, the big moorland area. There's a big stone circle called Scorrel there, biggest stone circle on Dartmoor, and I went out there with 3 friends. We drove out there to see the circle, and you can park quite near to the circle, but we didn't know that at the time, so we parked a fair way away, and we were walking across the moors and fields to get to it, and it was twilight, but it was still light, you could see where you were going. And we walked into this one field that had a dry stone wall around it and a metal gate. We opened the gate, went in, shut the gate, there was some sheep in the field, and we were trying to find the gate at the other side, and it wasn't a big field. It wasn't a great big field, it was a fairly small field. And we were walking around in it, and it struck me that we seemed to have been walking for a very long time looking for the gate, and we couldn't find it. And the whole thing had a sort of dreamlike feel to it, sort of sense of unreality, like almost like you were walking through treacle. And I noticed that it was getting dark, and we must have been in this field for quite a while. Then next to the dry stone wall appears a ring of lights like you would get on a big wheel, and they were bluish white, and they were about 5 feet across. This circle picked out by white lights. And I said, look at that, and everybody looked at it, and then it winked out, and we were all there scratching our heads thinking, what the hell was that? Then the lights come back on again, but this time they're in the configuration of the outline of a person. And the best thing I can liken it to is when you get, like there, you get the man and the woman on toilets. And it was like the man, arms and legs together like that, but the head was sort of down into the shoulders, so it didn't have much of a neck. And it was about 5 feet tall, and the outline, almost like a dot to dot, in these bluey white lights. And then that vanished. And I realised then some weird shit was going on. And I remembered there is a piece of folklore that if you are under the spell of pixies on Dartmoor, the thing to do is to take your coat off, turn it inside out, put it on again. It's where the term turncoat comes from, because it breaks the spell. It frees your mind because you're doing something mundane. It breaks the spell. So I said to everybody, okay, everybody, take your coats off, turn them inside out and put them on again. And it was drizzling as well, which is a really weird thing to say to anybody. If you're out for a walk with your mates and someone says, oh, okay, everybody, get your coats off, turn them inside out, put them on again, they'd think you were mad. But nobody said, Rich, are you fucking radio rental or what? Why are you asking us to do that? They just did it instantly, and then we all saw the gate right in front of us. Right in front of us. And the weird thing was that on the way home, none of us spoke about it, or what this strangeness that had just happened. And that is probably the weirdest individual thing that's happened to me. I've had several weird things happen to me, but that probably takes the biscuit. Anybody else? Any more? Oh, lady there.
So you're another one of your weird stories. You said that's the worst. What would be the second weird?
Oh, God, there's all sorts of things. One of the times I was out looking for the Tasmanian wolf, my mate Mike said, well, I know this couple. There was an English bloke from Birmingham, married a Aussie, moved to, in the 60s, they moved to central Tasmania, right in the middle of Tasmania, near this artificial lake called Bronte Lake, and they built their house themselves, so they raised goats. And he says, you know, their daughter when she was walking home from school once, saw a Tasmanian wolf. So we'll go and talk to them about that. But the weird thing is that in the woods outside of their house, every single night, unless it's raining, if it's raining it won't come, there are these weird lights, and he said they're like, almost like light bulbs, they like appear. And he says, I think they're paranormal, I've seen them. So I went along not expecting much to happen, and I talked to this couple and they told me about their daughter, who wasn't there at the time, and back in the 70s she'd seen a Tasmanian wolf when she was coming home from school. So we went outside about 10 o'clock at night, and they're supposed to appear at 10, and then they're there till about 12, and they cut off dead at 12, as if it's a performance and they're ending it. So I wasn't expecting anything. Then all of a sudden, over the chicken coop appears a yellowy white light. It's about the size of a large grape, and it's sort of lozenge shaped. It's not a firefly, because I've seen loads of them all over the world, and it is not a glowworm, because I've seen those as well. It's there for a while, and then it winks off, and I thought, blimey, maybe there's something to this. Then in the woods at the back of the house, these lights start coming on, and as many as 4 are visible at any one time. So Mike and I go into the woods, we see these lights, some of them are on the floor, some of them are in trees, some of them are just floating in midair. You could get to within 10 foot of them, then they would wink out, then they would appear further in the woods, and you go further in, they'd wink out, you go further in, and then you turn around and they'd be behind you. So Mike said, what we'll do is drive to the other side of Bronte Lagoon, because there is a lighthouse there, to make sure that it's got nothing to do with the lighthouse. I'd never thought it had, because the lighthouse would be a solid beam, not these little lozenges of light. So we drove to the other side of Bronte Lagoon, and the lighthouse, its beam didn't come anywhere near these woods or this house, because they're up on a cliff. You've got the house, woods, cliff, then the lagoon, so the beam doesn't come anywhere near it. But as we're at the other side of Bronte Lagoon, up in the trees, in the canopy, we see a beach ball sized red light, a sphere glowing there. So we drive back round. By the time we get there, it's gone. The couple who own this house said they saw it too. They thought it was orange rather than red. And then at 12 o'clock it just stops. And I got up to go to the toilet at about 2:30 in the morning, and I stayed for half an hour watching, but nothing more happened. They said once one of these little lights came very close to the house and went along a window box, and in the morning all the plants were dead. Another thing I did was an experiment to try and create a thought form, a tulpa of a giant spider, but that's quite a long story. That would be a talk unto itself. It was more successful than I bargained for. Any other questions?
Has your fear ever outweighed your curiosity?
Have I ever what? Sorry?
Like, have you ever been too, so scared that you thought, I can't do this anymore?
No, I never have. No, never. I've been stalked by a tiger in Sumatra. I've been attacked by a cobra. I've fell off a cliff and been hanging onto tree roots. I've nearly fell down a crevasse. I've nearly been washed away by rapids. But I've never felt frightened. Well, the thing that annoys me most is human bureaucracy in these expeditions. The last expedition we did to Sumatra, the bureaucracy, both with the airline and when the authorities, when you got to Sumatra, was just insane. But no, I've never been frightened of anything. I used to be a zookeeper. I used to work with reptiles, crocodiles, alligators, snakes, lizards, tortoises, turtles, and I've worked with some huge crocodiles and poisonous snakes and things. And the only thing that frightens me, other than the prospect of the Tories being in power much longer, the only thing that frightens me is moths. I'm terrified of large moths. I will shit my fucking pants and squeal like a girl if I see a large moth. Show me a 30-foot crocodile that's a man-eater and I'll be going, ace, great. Show me a moth, I'll be running in the opposite direction.
It's so cute though.
You are?
It's so cute though.
Oh, they're terrifying. Ugh, they're horrible, fluttering monsters. Ugh. Ugh. I don't mind little ones, but big ones. Oh, God, no. Ugh, ugh. Right, is that your lot? Okie doke.
Well, that was different, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You should do a bit of stand-up as well. You've got a few laughs tonight as well. Yeah, very good. We'll have to get Richard back to talk about the dragons next year, I think.
Well, I'll do a whole talk on dragons. I've written 2 books on dragons.
Yeah,
I'll
so...
do a whole talk on dragons and modern day dragons.
Yeah, and sort of comes in with the old UFO myths as well. I think fiery dragons and lights in the sky.
If you've never read it, get a hold of... If you've never read it, get a hold of F.W. Holliday's book, The Dragon and the Disc. That's absolute Fortean classic. But, yeah, my books are available online. My 2 latest are called Adventures in Cryptozoology, which is a shit title that I didn't choose. Adventures in Cryptozoology and In Search of Real Monsters. They're my 2 latest ones. I've also written a book called Dragons More Than a Myth and Explore Dragons. And if you type my name in, you'll get them. My new book, The Highest Strangeness, which is about monsters, ghosts, UFOs, but high strangeness cases, should be out early next year. And I'm currently working on a book on man-eating animals. So, yeah, you'll probably get them online if you type in Richard Freeman and look for my books. You can order them through most good bookshops and probably through most crap bookshops as well.
Yeah, you mentioned F.W. Holliday. F.W. Holliday wrote The Dragon and the Disc, which I got a copy of that. He co-wrote the David Enigma with Randall Jones Pugh about the West Wales flap of 1977. So, yeah, check that out if you can get a copy.